In a large environment, it's very unlikely that you and I are just going to give every administrator who needs to work on the network full administrator rights everywhere and say, just have a good time. Instead, we're going to use the rule of least privilege, which means that we're going to give the users just enough permissions and rights for them to do the job they were paid to do, but we're not going to give them excessive rights. And one method of giving individuals and groups the rights they need to do their job is a method called role-based access control. So for example, if we have a new employee, such as Alice, who comes to work and her job is to manage the DHCP scopes in our environment, what we want to do is give her the rights to manage the DHCP scopes, and that's it. We wouldn't want to also include DNS or other directory services rights outside of what she needs to do her job. So to implement this role-based access control type of functionality with IPAM, and just as a reminder of where we're at, here we have server 3, which is our IPAM server. And the IPAM server has a nice conversation going on with both server 2 and also DC-nug. And then you and I, as we sit here, we can both push commands and push configuration through IPAM, which in turn pushes them out to our servers. And we can also, of course, retrieve information so that we're looking at the latest and greatest information here at our client. So if we wanted to carve up the responsibility, for example, for either all of DNS or maybe just DNS records, or all of DHCP or just DHCP scopes or specific scopes, we could do that with role-based access control. And here's the 3 main ingredients for role-based access control. First, we have roles. And when you think of roles, just think of them as a set of permissions, like what you can do. And there's some built-in roles as part of IPAM with access control. For example, there's an IPAM DNS administrator, which can manage DNS servers and their associated DNS zones and the resource records. And on the lighter side, there's also a DNS record administrator, which has the rights to deal with records, but not DNS as a whole. On the DHCP side, there's a role for the IPAM DHCP administrator. And also regarding DHCP, on the lighter side, there's an IPAM DHCP scope administrator. So again, these are just sets of rights or permissions that each of these roles is associated with. And if we don't like the default roles, we don't have to use them. We can go ahead and create our own custom roles as well and assign exactly the permissions that we want to these custom roles. Next, we have the question of where are these roles going to be applied? Where can a user effectively take advantage of these permissions? And that's controlled based on access scopes. So an access scope, for example, could identify a specific DNS zone that we want the permissions applied to, or a specific DHCP scope. For example, maybe we have a DHCP scope administrator role that we want to be applied to a specific DHCP scope. And the access scope would allow us to do that. Now, it is unfortunate that we have the word scope in 2 different places. We have DHCP scopes. For example, there's a scope for this network right here, the 192.168.1.0 network. So we have a DHCP scope for that. And now, as we add in role-based access control, we have an access scope that we could also then apply that points to that specific scope. So for this DHCP scope, we could have an access scope called scope A, and let's go ahead and call this access scope A, that is basically controlling the where the rights are going to be applied. And the access policy binds those 2 together. For example, let's take the user Alice. Just think about Alice. Came to work. Her job is to do DHCP scope administration. And specifically, we only want her to be able to do scope administration for this single scope. So what we did, we created an access scope that points out just that one scope. And then in our access policy, we said that we want this role of DHCP scope admin to be applicable for Alice anywhere that access scope A exists. And at this moment, it's only associated with that one scope. In the future, if we want that to be a bigger responsibility, we can go ahead and associate access scope A with the 10.0.0 scope. And then once we associate access scope A with those 2 scopes, and because the DHCP scope administrator role is associated with that scope, she would automatically, as part of our access policy, have the same privileges of DHCP scope administrator for this scope, the 192.168.1, and this scope, the 10.0.0. So role-based access control is 3 basic things. Number 1, we have the roles, which identify permissions or sets of rights. What could potentially be done with those rights? Secondly, we have access scopes, which identify the where those rights could be applied if a role was associated with the scope. And the access policy is doing exactly that. It's associating the role that we want, the permissions, with the access scopes or the locations where we want those rights applied. So as an example, here's what I propose we do. Let's take a user and let's go ahead and use Alice. And let's also create a group. And let's call it Group A with Alice. And that way, when you see Group A with Alice, you'll know, oh, that's the group that Alice belongs to. From a learning perspective, it's fantastic. So Alice will be a member of that group. We'll put her in there. And then we'll create an access scope. And an access scope, I'd like to just reinforce that the access scope is identifying where, which objects in IPAM are we focused on. Is it this scope? Is it that DNS zone, etc.? So we'll need to create an access scope, and then we'll also associate that access scope. In our example, let's go ahead and use the 192.168.1 DHCP scope. So we'll have an access scope that's associated with a DHCP scope as an object that IPAM can manage. And then third, we need to link the role with the access scope. And as part of linking that role with the access scope, we'll also associate the group, Group A, with Alice in it, as part of that access policy. So if we follow the bouncing ball, if the role that we use here is, for example, the DHCP scope administrator, and we've associated with the access scope that points to just that one scope, and we've also associated Group A with that access policy, then as a result of Alice being a member of that group, Alice will get those rights, specifically the DHCP scope administrator rights, but only to that one object, in this case the DHCP scope, where the access scope is applied. So let's walk through that together in the live interface, and then you can practice it hands-on to reinforce the concepts. So we're starting off here on our Windows 10 client, and we're going to launch Server Manager using the icon in the taskbar. We'll give that a minute to initialize, and then on the left-hand side, we'll go ahead and select IPAM. With IPAM on the far left selected, what we're going to do is go all the way down in this list to Access Control. And with Access Control selected, we now have the option of looking at the roles, these sets of permissions. Here are the default roles that come with IPAM as part of role-based access control, free of charge. Now we can't delete these or modify these, but if we want to create new ones, we can go to Tasks and create a new custom role with exactly the privileges and permissions that we want. And from here, we can also click on Access Scopes. By default, there is one, /global, which applies everywhere. Which means that if we took a user account like Alice and we associated her with the access scope of global, along with the role of IPAM administrator, let me go back and take a look at roles for a moment. That's this one right here. Effectively, she would have King Kong rights everywhere. She could do everything within IPAM that IPAM can do. And the way that we would associate Alice with the administrator role and with the access scope is by creating an access policy. Now, for our example, we're not going to give Alice King Kong rights everywhere. We want to limit it down to a specific scope, a DHCP scope, and specific privileges. The DHCP scope administrator role associated with that scope. So I just realized I don't have a user account called Alice. So let's just pause for a moment and let's create an Active Directory group and a user called Alice, and then we can use that group respectively as part of our access policy. So from the Tools menu, here in Server Manager, from the drop-down, we'll go ahead and select Active Directory Users and Computers. We'll bring that full screen, and let's go ahead and create a new user. I'm just going to use the shortcut up here on the menu bar, and let's call this user Alice, and her login name will be Alice. We'll click on Next, and I'm not going to make her change her password. I'm going to say our password never expires, and I am going to supply our lab password. And we'll put in the confirmation as well. Looks great, and we'll click on Next. Great, so now we've got a user account named Alice. And now let's create a group. So I'm going to use a shortcut here on the menu bar also for creating a new group. And we'll call the group _A_ with _Alice. And no, in a production environment, you might want to call this the group that can do scope administration for a specific scope or something more detailed. Because effectively what we're going to do in this demo is that's what we're going to give this group rights to, is to be a scope administrator for a specific DHCP scope. So we'll click on OK. Now that group exists. So there's our group A with Alice. We need to add Alice to that group. So let's go ahead and grab Alice from the list, right click, and from the drop down we'll say add to group. And the group we want to add her to is group _A, and we'll go ahead and do a check names. There we go. Group A with Alice. Fantastic. We'll click OK. So let's go ahead and minimize the Active Directory users and computers and go back to IPAM. So here in IPAM, with IPAM on the far left selected and selecting Access Control, let me scooch this over a little bit so we can read that better. So with Access Control selected, let's create a custom access scope so we have something other than just global. So to do that, we'll click on Access Scopes. There's our default scope, Global, that everything in IPAM is associated with already. And what we'll do is we'll simply go ahead and click on Tasks, and then from the drop-down, we'll click on Add Access Scope. And we'll maximize that window. So there's not too many choices here. If we want to create a new access scope, we'll click on New. And let's go ahead and call this new access scope just for 192. That's what we'll name it. And we'll click on Add. And then we'll click on OK. So now in our access scopes, we have a global, which is applied everywhere, and we have an access scope called just for 192, which isn't applied anywhere yet. We need to associate this scope with our DHCP 192 network scope if we wanted to then bind Alice's group and the role of DHCP scope administrator to it. So let's make a road trip up to the DHCP scopes. To do that, we'll click on DHCP scopes beneath the monitor and manage section. And we can sort these by scope ID, which I'm going to do, and then go to the very bottom. And there's our 192.168.1. So we'll select that. And notice right here, by default, the scope is global. And we can change that just by right-clicking on that scope. And then use the option second from the bottom, Set Access Scope. And here what we'll do is we're not going to inherit it from the parent. We're going to say we want you to use just for 192. And click on OK. So now we've created an access scope. We've associated the access scope with this DHCP object scope for 192 network. And now we're going to go back to access control. And what we're going to do is we're going to associate this role, the IPAM DHCP scope administrator, along with the access scope, the 192 access scope that we just created, which only is applied to the 192 network. And then we'll include the group that Alice belongs to so that effectively Alice, as a member of that group, will get those permissions. So to do that, we're going to go to Access Policies. So what we'll do is we'll click on Tasks, and from the drop-down, click on Add Access Policy. We'll go ahead and bring that full screen. And from here, we can go ahead and add a user. I should also mention that we could add a group, which is what we're going to do. So we'll click on Add, and we'll go ahead and type in Alice's group, which is group _A, and we'll go ahead and do a check names. Wah, 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 wah. So we're sitting at a Windows client, and that's where it's checking. It's checking locally. So what we'll do is just click on the Locations button here over to the right and tell it that we want to search nuggetlab.com and not the local client machine, and click on OK. All right, now we'll do a check names looking for Group A, and there it is, Group A with Alice. We'll click OK. And now as part of this access policy, we've identified the group, so we're part of the way there. And now we need to do two more things. We need to identify the role, the permissions of DHCP scope administrator, and where it's going to apply, what scope we want to associate this access with. So for the access settings, we'll click on New, and let's scroll down a little bit to make sure we can see everything. And it's asking us for the role. So from the drop-down, we'll select IPAM DHCP scope administrator role, if that's the role we want to assign, and we'll also associate that with the scope, the one we created called just for 192, which is associated because we associated it with the 192 DHCP scope. And we'll go ahead and click on Add Setting. So here's the magic in the access policy. This group with these permissions on any objects that are associated with that access scope. And then to make this happen, we're going to go ahead and click on OK. And it's now saving those changes. So now, let me scroll this over a little bit and bring this over a little bit. So here's our access policy that is in place. Now, if we had specified Alice directly and not a group, it would show Alice's name right here in the user field. So now, regarding what Alice could do, if Alice logged on and she launched the remote server administration tools and clicked on IPAM and she selected DHCP scopes, she would have permissions for this scope named the 192 network because that's where the access scope is applied, where she got her permissions via the role of the IPAM DHCP scope administrator. So she could do things like change the name or edit that scope. She could just go crazy, have a lot of fun with that scope. However, if she went to other objects in IPAM, whether they're DNS or different DHCP scopes, because the access policy isn't giving her rights to those other objects, she wouldn't have the permissions to go ahead and manipulate or change them. So in this nugget, we've discussed and then done a demonstration regarding role-based access control as part of IP address management. And it boils down to three basic things. Number one, we're going to use access scopes to control where permissions apply. Number two, we're either going to use the built-in roles or create our custom roles to identify what they can do, what the actual permissions are. And then third, we're going to create access policies to associate a user or a group with an access scope, a location, and a role regarding what they can do at that location for the management of some component that IPAM currently controls. And now, my friend, it is your turn. I would invite you to watch this video again and then go step by step through the hands-on labs to practice and reinforce the skills and the concepts regarding RBAC in an IPAM environment. So have some fun with the lab, and I'll see you, my friend, in the next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.